Very much. This is a topic of huge interest to me, and I have learned and am learning a lot as I go about this. And what I'm talking about is how we got the contemporary picture of churches and places of worship in and around State College. And I'm going to divide this very simply into three parts, which is new churches, old churches, and changing churches. And so what you see here is the Presbyterian Church, which, as I say, when it was built in 1913, stood in pretty much empty territory. And now, of course, it's surrounded by all this new growth, and you can see the skyline developing. And just as a snapshot, in 1946, I just happen to have figures of that. You get these numbers that I quoted last time of members, and you see it's all very much mainline churches: Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, and those are the big churches in 1946. And most of the smaller denominations that we think of, or the other denominations, just are not here. They really hit a lot later. So a couple of images representing that old church world. These, of course, are a couple of the really lovely St. Andrew's stained glasses. And I would emphasize this, not only are these, they're beautiful in their own right, but they reflect a particular image of church, which is very clergy centered. That's reflected in the architecture. And as we'll see, as newer churches emerge from the 1950s onwards, they react against this. They move for structures that are more non-hierarchical, often non-liturgical. Anyway, quick point. State College has a mushroom growth during the 20th century. I find these numbers kind of remarkable. You see, between 1940 and 1960, for example, the town goes from 6,000 to 22,000 people, and it just rolls on through the 1960s. I hesitate to say there isn't a town here in 1920, but there isn't much. So these churches like St. Andrew's and the Presbyterian Church are really daring enterprises in very new territory. In the mid-century, it is obvious that a major urban center is developing in State College. And I make an obvious point. All these numbers are State College borough. They don't include the townships. They don't include the areas around where a lot of the growth happens, Ferguson Township, Patton Township. So if you think of the State College metro area, the growth is phenomenal. All denominations recognize this, and they have to figure out how to respond to it. There's something else going on at this time, which is in the 1950s and 1960s, church attendance, church loyalties are higher, possibly, than they have ever been. To give you an idea, in the late 20th century, the proportion of Americans who belong to churches is far, far higher than it was, say, before the Civil War. It's a much more religious environment. Denominations respond to this. And there's a boom of new churches in the 1950s. And you'll notice, the Assemblies of God and the Church of Christ. And there's a common theme here. What these churches will often do is they will set up in some of the newer developments around town. And you look at roads, Westerly Parkway, Easterly Parkway, University Drive. As those roads develop, so new churches develop there, partly because prices are lower, but also they want to be among these expanding new suburban populations. I'll also add one thing, which is one of the key dates in this story, which is when the Eisenhower Chapel is opened on campus in 1956. That really takes a lot of the business, so to speak, that churches had done away from and gives it to this new entity, to college and university chaplaincies. So a lot of the churches and denominations which had regarded themselves as serving town and university really concentrate much more on the town. Incidentally, when the Eisenhower Chapel was opened, there were 5 big denominations, 5 big chaplaincies, of which the Episcopal at that point was one of the largest. That's certainly been a change through the years. And the other very common story you see is that these denominations build churches like the Assemblies of God. They build something on West College Avenue. And at the time, they're not very large. As they develop, then they move to these newer, often suburban properties, which are very, very substantial. And I just draw your attention to this Calvary Baptist one. That's a really interesting story that I'll be just talking about briefly. It opens in 1958. Again, University Drive, major expansion in 1974. And I'll take up that story in a little while, but that's an interesting story. That's a very familiar building. That is Grace Lutheran. That represents what you might call the new church world of the 1960s. That building is 1965. And I cannot stress how important that is for State College and its churches. We tend to drive past it, we walk past it, and we see it. It's a very familiar thing. Let me stress what a radical design it is. And that was a major piece of architecture of its time. And it represents these new ideas that I'm talking about. If you go inside the interior, well, you can't right now, I think, because of the pandemic. But if you go inside, they tried to make the worship space more circular, gathered around the central area. They try and decenter what the clergy are doing. But that's a major piece of very heavily European influenced architecture. And I think we take it for granted. Clearly, it's something of its time. It's 1965. But it ushers in an age that reaches its peak between 1965 and 1970, not just when you have new churches, but when many of the old churches and places of worship invest heavily in these new facilities. Grace Lutheran's one of the classics. And this is just a very quick summary. If anyone, don't bother about the actual dates. I'd be very happy to send anyone these PowerPoints if they want them. But between 1965 and 1970, look what happens. Grace Lutheran has this old premises, basically at, where are we? College and Atherton. They're an expanding parish. They need more parking. They need new space. They create this wonderful new building, and they move to Garner and Beaver. And lots of new churches emerge at that point. The Jewish Community Center, which is later to be called Brit Shalom. Again, 1965, it moves to its property on Hamilton. You get these other new churches opening. And the other great one is Our Lady of Victory, which from 1917 until 1969 had actually been near neighbors of St. Andrews. They're up on Fairmount and Fraser. And again, they decide we've got a vastly bigger congregation, vastly bigger parish. Let's build a really quite a dramatic new building. So they move out to where it is right now, which is Wesley Parkway. And you see what I'm saying about, think of the roads, Eastleigh Parkway, Wesley Parkway, University Drive. That's where the new churches are. That's where the new architecture is. And that's also where something else happens, which is a new approach to liturgy and what church services are about, less centered on the priest or the pastor or the cleric, more of a sense of the congregation, more emphasis on circles than straight lines, trying to make it less hierarchical. By the way, the other thing you can do here is you can map the growth of Penn State, which again is a phenomenal growth. And if you think of what some people would call the greatest place of worship in this region, which is Beaver Stadium, It's in 1960 that Beaver Stadium moves off campus to its present site. So in other words, you get this sense of settling outlying areas. So once again, you get Grace Lutheran, very striking building, very striking interior. Interestingly, both the old places of worship, which were Our Lady of Victory and Grace Lutheran, were both demolished, in one case for apartments. And it's very, very hard to get any images or pictures of them. And I've tried. I've not been out to the Centre County Archives. I'm sure they've got something. But it's interesting how thoroughly they have, in a sense, dropped off the map. Here's another example. There's this great new development just emerging in the late 60s in Park Forest, a very far-sighted denomination, which is called the Evangelical United Brethren, the EUB, very strong Pennsylvania denomination, German roots, creates this church to serve Park Forest. So they built it in 1967. The following year, they merge into the United Methodists, and that is now a Methodist church. But it gives you a sense of this expansion that is geared for new suburbs as they emerge. There's a lot of planning going on. A lot of denominations are looking at State College, seeing these developments happening, and thinking, you know, where can we take advantage of this? Where can we serve these new and emerging congregations? And they use the architecture of the time. There's another very famous example in town, Our Lady of Victory, OLV. You can tell that's from just a couple of years after Grace Lutheran. And again, it does what I'm saying about a very different approach to the altar area, the sanctuary, and it does something which is really quite radical. If you've ever been inside OLV, and you have these waves and these curves, and over to the left there, the host is reserved. It is very much of its time, of the late 60s, and opinions vary. I have quite often taken Catholic visitors to see the church, and they're sort of divided. And some will say, oh, this is very adventurous, this is very exciting. And I have had people say, it makes me seasick. So the opinions vary, but it's an interesting building. The other great piece of fairly new architecture we have from a bit later, it's really the 1980s, is Good Shepherd Church. Again, this is out in Gray's Wood, and it's as far from any traditional sense of Catholic architecture, liturgical architecture, as you can get. It's a lovely facility. But if you go inside the main worship space where they normally, before the pandemic, have their masses on a Sunday, it's very different from St. Andrew's or from a traditional Catholic church. It is very open space. There's nowhere to kneel because the sense is kneeling represents private devotion. And you look at it, and it could be a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church. It's a different approach to worship. You do have spaces there that are more traditional, but they're somewhat kind of set aside from the main space where you would gather of a Sunday. And you have so many churches. There's a nice story attached to this. For many years, State College was home to a very enterprising, very, what should I say, very impressive individual called Paul Graybill, who was the minister of the Assemblies of God Church. And I admired Pastor Graybill enormously. He had a great church, a lovely family. And he had this great vision of a newer and much, much larger facility, which was built on Whitehall, and that was his great passion project. And at the time, and this very often happens, I think people thought, well, that's so far out of town. Why on earth would he do that? And then, of course, he got so much building in that area, and you realized he was in the center of rapidly developing areas. I mentioned this as a slightly, as a bittersweet thing, because Pastor Grable died at a very tragically early age, but in a sense, that impressive church is his monument. So the point I'm making is that from the 1960s onwards, you get all these new churches, which are usually radically different from how people thought of church and churchy architecture from the days of the Presbyterian Church or St. Andrews or Faith United Church of Christ. And they are also different in setting. They are out of the immediate town center in many cases, and often they're out in what would once have been really distant suburban areas that have now become part of this larger, I suppose some people would say sprawl, but this larger metropolitan area. You know, the fact of State College's growth as a metropolitan area is one of the great forces in Pennsylvania history in modern times. I've talked about new churches. What about the old churches? And together with the growth of State College, you get the decline of many urban areas, of many rural areas, many of the villages and small towns. And one of the great forces you get in the landscape over the last 40 or 50 years is more and more deserted or abandoned churches. And we drive past them and we look at them and think, what on earth was that? What denomination was it? And I just want to draw your attention to a resource that is I find really interesting. Up at Lycoming College, lycoming.edu, you have the archives of the United Methodist Church in this area. Some great person up there has put together a resource on abandoned churches in the Methodist tradition in the Center region and in Center County. There are 70 churches which were Methodist or Evangelical or United Brethren, including a lot that are in what you and I would call the Greater State College area. And you can get some great histories here of the churches that died. Just to give you an example, they have a photograph of one church in Huntingdon County, and you think, boy, I don't know that area. And there's a reason for that, which is this is a set of fields that are presently under Raystown Lake. And you can see the church that Raystown Lake stands on, which is an interesting idea. And I'm not going to go through all 70, but just to give you an example of a couple of things they have in Lamont, which has been absorbed into the State College metro area. There was an old evangelical church. You can read all about it. And you can read its history from 1883. And it is now, it says, a specialty store in Lamont. You can go to a place like Pine Grove Mills, and you can see this church, which was a Methodist church, and was sold in 1946, is now a private residence. The point I'm trying to make is you could actually write a very interesting article or book on what happens to churches when they fade from use. What happens to those church facilities? In some cases, the congregations merge into larger organizations. In some of the congregations literally die out or fade away. I've certainly seen some do that in the State College area in my time. What are the options? Well, some are demolished. Lots of them are demolished. I think building a lake over one is a kind of extreme way of getting rid of a church. But where is the old Grace Lutheran Church in State College? Where is the old Our Lady of Victory? They're not there anymore, and there's no memory of them. We don't have plaques that say, you know, here stood this church. And you might make the very important point that a church is not its building, it's the congregation. The congregation in most cases lives on. And you're absolutely right. But I think what happens to the buildings is interesting. What happens? Some become private residences, some become stores, some become barns. There is a whole church landscape out there. But one of the most interesting things for me is the churches that become other churches. I mentioned Pine Grove Mills. If you drive through Pine Grove Mills, you will see two very handsome buildings right next door to each other. And mid 19th century buildings, basically Civil War era. And this building is the old Lutheran church. Obviously, Pine Grove Mills had a very strong German presence, Lutheran presence. It's right next to the Presbyterian church there. But then you look at the sign and you realize, well, no, it's actually not Lutheran. It's Anglican. The Anglican Church was an offshoot of the Episcopal Church, formed during one of the various divisions and schisms within the church. I wouldn't put an exact date. I think this denomination goes back to about 1980. But I'm delighted to see that this Anglican Church has taken over this lovely old building. And like I say, you need to learn to read churches, to read notice boards, and to read foundation stones. And very often what you will find is what it says on the notice board, this is an Anglican church or whatever, is not what it says on the foundation stone. Churches change over time. And you can say that in the history of church buildings, the only constant is change. Okay, St. Andrews has been there since 1928, very good. Many other churches have changed. In many areas, that is a process of ethnic development. You get new immigration, new immigrant populations, and they will take over an old church. If you go up to West College Heights, there's one building on Glen Road that I find very interesting. I don't know its complete history, but I know it was the Unitarian church for a while. Then the Unitarians moved to a nice new facility. Then it was the mosque, the Islamic Center. Then the Muslims moved out to their good new facility. And I'm not sure what it is right now. Churches go through phases. Churches are spaces, they are used, they are reused. Meanwhile, what happened to the Lutherans of Pine Grove Mills? Well, they moved to a handsome new facility with lots of parking. So the congregation moves, the buildings change, and that really is, if you like, the summary of the history out here. I want to tell one story very quickly, because it does really epitomize so much of what I'm talking about. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a church on University Drive, which was called Calvary Baptist. A Calvary Baptist was very interesting. Baptists are not very strong in this area. And Calvary Baptist was really unusual because it belonged to a denomination that originated in the Midwest in a Swedish revival in the 19th century. And I've never entirely figured out how we got from the Swedish Midwest to University Drive. There's a story there. I don't know it. In 1974, they erect a new building. And then in the last few years, they had expanded so rapidly and so dramatically that they moved out to an area called Harvest Fields, which is an extraordinarily impressive structure. It's very near the ski slopes for those of you. If you ever drive up there, you have some of the best views in the center region. But it's a great example of churches moving up and a different concept of what churches are and what they should be doing. And this is one of the few examples in our area of a common American pattern these days, which is the mega church. I think it's like a 26,000 square foot facility. And I'm getting the date a little bit wrong. I think it opened maybe 2014, but it's a very, very recent phenomenon. Great example of a booming, successful church. And I just pulled this off their website, and you'll see that as far as they're concerned, they have harvest fields, but they also have all these other facilities for Sunday worship. In non-pandemic times, they meet in Tyrone, they meet in Millheim, they take over the State Theatre. But the point I'm making is that this is it's like an authentic mega church representing, if you like, a new generation of what churches are doing. You know, that's not the right way to do things. It's not the wrong way to do things. Dress represents a phase. And that also tells another familiar story, which is, so what happened to the old Calvary Baptist Church on University Drive? It becomes a new ethnic congregation. It becomes the Chinese Alliance Church. And you can map these churches. The Chinese Alliance met for a while on Eastleigh Parkway. Then they passed that one over to a Korean church. They moved out to University Drive. And it might be that if they prosper enough, maybe that they will move out to a new facility in the suburbs. You know, long may they prosper. If you drive out on West 26, you'll see another very interesting building that represents a whole story in its own right. Before you get into Pine Grove Mills, you pass an impressive new structure on the right, and that is a Russian Baptist congregation. In the 1980s, in the last days of the Soviet Union, a large number of Siberian Baptists were brought to central Pennsylvania, to State College. They formed quite a flourishing congregation, and they built they built a building. And you know, it's not an old established community here, but State College is such a mushroom growth. Who can claim to be old established in within the borough? So in that sense, State College is representing a very common pattern as ethnic groups move in. So they build new places of worship. It's been a matter of grievance to me for many years that we don't have a Hindu temple in the area. I would dearly love to see that, not least because when I was teaching religious studies, I always wanted to have somewhere where I could show my students this is a Hindu temple. And meanwhile, you're probably wondering, you know, why on earth would Calvary Baptist move out to Harvest Fields? Well, it's not as if they have good views there. Well, yeah, sort of. They really do. They have some of the best views in the center region, and it's a lovely place. So when you deal with a motorized society, a suburban society, you move out of the downtown. You can afford to have a very different sort of aesthetic and a look of premises. Well, look, I've done a very quick run through the trends in the churches around here. New roads, new suburbs, new concepts of liturgy and hierarchy, and so on, new ethnic community. And I hope you'll forgive me if I end up by coming back home, which is it's not an old church. We still have to celebrate our centennial in this building. I hope it'll be a magnificent event. But compared to the other congregations in town, that is now very much the older generation of churches and concepts of church. And my view is there is space for all the different concepts. And I'll be interested in, if you come back here in 10 years, what the new range of churches will be, what the new ethnic groups will be, what the new denominations will be. And I have my particular interests and groups I'd favor, but that's me. So with your permission, I will wind up at that point, and I will throw open for any questions and comments. And the one nightmare I have is I very much hope that I have not been unfair to any denomination or church. Thank you very much.